Okay, so sorry for that ridiculous delay. Sometimes the projector, there's like a Wi-Fi connection between the projector and the computer, and it just fritzes out. It takes time to get it back. Anyway, so today we're going to talk about typography, fonts, font choice, font size, what's an X height, that sort of thing. Typography is not the kind of thing that really I can do justice to in one lecture. It's the kind of thing that really would take a whole class to really explain well. I hope today to give you an overview of what the major topics are, what certain factors you might try to pay attention to with text, and maybe even inspire you to kind of get interested in typography in general. One of the things that I would give you for homework, if I gave homework in this class, is to watch the Steve Jobs commencement speech that he did for Stanford. And I'm serious, this is worth your 15 minutes of your time or whatever. He gave it right after he survived cancer the first time. Would have been early 2000s, something like that, if I'm remembering correctly. Really, really worth your 15 minutes. But he talks about what in his life, being a non-college graduate, got him to be where he was with the design sensibilities that he had, which, whether you like Apple products or not, I think we could all agree that he certainly did a lot for the design of an object and really pushing the value of that. The fact that we went from like a Motorola Razr to an iPhone is a pretty big leap in a matter of a year or whatever. Steve Jobs attributed all of his design sense to a class that I don't even know if he officially took the class, he might have just sat in on the class, that was a class on typography. And I think that is a good segue into how important this is. Fonts, how we read type, how we use type is really critical. And in a lot of graphic design and even architectural presentations and whatever, the text really can matter. And it's so often kind of shoved to the side and then done as an afterthought. And I think if it's used as a true tool, you can really go somewhere with it. And so the hope is today that I'll at least inspire you to start thinking about it as opposed to pushing it off to the side. So let's start with a little bit of a definition of terms so that we can talk about fonts and you have an idea of what I'm actually speaking with. Some of this should be obvious because you've been around computers enough to know that there is such thing as bold, right? Italics, that sort of thing. Those are referred to as styles of text. So generally you would have a font and then you would have several styles that go with it: bold, italic, regular, that kind of thing. They're used primarily to provide contrast or to indicate, like let's say you're doing your history paper and you want to indicate a quotation or a citation or something like that, you might use italics for that. Generally, if you can, choose the font style from within the font family rather than from within the operating system. So if you're in Word and you're typing up your English paper, you may see that you have the option of, I have Helvetica regular, or let's use Arial for example, because I think Windows computers have Arial. So I have Arial, and then I have Arial bold, and I have Arial italic, right? Or you could say, I have Arial, and you go up to the edit menu and say bold, right? So you have two different ways of doing that. When you go up to the edit menu and say make this font bold, the computer says, you want the font to be a little fatter, so let me just thicken all the lines, right? If instead of doing that, if you go and you pick from your font list the font that says Arial bold instead of Arial, that is the one that the typeface designer, the person who designed the font in the first place, designed to be the bold font. So instead of just fattening up all the strokes, making them a little bit thicker, somebody actually spent some time and thought about what does a bold version of this font look like. So generally that's a better version of the bold. Or we could go the italic route if we do edit italics, right? Or Control I or whatever, right? It just takes the regular text and slants it over. Okay? If you pick the italic version of the font, the designers thought about how far should the text be slanted? What does it look like? How do the letters combine together when it's slanted? So it's a little bit better version. And when we're talking about typography, certainly in posters, architectural presentation boards and stuff, how your font looks really matters. And so if you can choose the version that the designer did, you're going to have better results. Weight refers to the relative lightness or darkness of the letter forms in general, and it is marked by changes in the stroke or line width. So you may see in your font list, You may say Arial Light or Arial Medium, right? You've probably seen this. Not all fonts have this, but some do. This is the designer again, the typographic designer, saying this is a medium version of my font. This is a bold version of my font. And so they're kind of controlling that weight. Width refers to different variations within the typeface family in terms of how wide the letters are. Condensed is basically squish things up. Compressed is somewhat squished, right? And extended means stretch out the letters a little bit. So those are different versions of the various fonts. And you guys have probably played around with this when you wanted, your English teacher told you you needed a 3-page paper and you really wrote a 2-page paper and you tried to like, let me bump the size up, let me make it a little, extended, right? Yeah. So you should all be familiar with it, right? So then we have something called X height. And X height refers to the height of lowercase letters, right? It gives us a judge of what the lowercase letters' heights are, and that's without ascenders or descenders, right? So that's without the tails. And the easiest way to look at it, no surprise it's called X height, is to look at the letter X, right? Gives us an idea of what that lowercase x is, how tall it is, and I'll show you a graphic that combines these in a second. Cap height refers to the height of a capital letter, right? And so there's a ratio between cap height and X height on any given font. And so cap height's measured from the baseline up to the top of the capital letter, right? Cap line. And so X height and cap height vary depending on the font. So if we look at the graphic of it, right? Our X height here is going to, in this case we have the letter A, but this could be an X, it doesn't matter, right? Is the height of a lowercase letter. We have an ascender here, this goes up above. We have a descender that goes below, right? Our full capital here has a cap height that goes all the way up to here, okay? And so this ratio, this to this, can vary depending on the font that you choose. Did I skip a slide? No, okay. Counters are white spaces located in and around letter forms. So this would be negative space around the letters. They affect legibility, or how easily you can read something. And they're going to also change a great deal when the fonts get larger, right? So something might look good when the font is small, but as it gets bigger and bigger, you might get more of these counter spaces, which is a little bit too much, makes it harder to read. So, for example, thin fonts at really large typefaces get to be a little bit more difficult to read because they have so much white space around them. It's certainly something to be aware of, right? Same thing happens with bold fonts if they get too small, right? They get too hard to read. Okay? Small capitals, which you saw on a couple slides ago, is a complete set of uppercase letters, right, that are the height of the X height, right? So they're small because they're X height. And the point of these, not every font has them, but they're great if it does, because when you're writing a paper or you need to use an acronym for something, you can use this cap height, and it doesn't put unwanted emphasis on certain words, right? So you can put something in all capitals because it's an acronym, but it doesn't call attention to it. And you may have noticed this in a word paper or something like that. They're great for abbreviations and titles on the spine of a book like this here, and that sort of thing. Lining and non-lining figures. Figures basically translates into numbers when we talk about it in the typographic sense. Lining figures are a set of numerals that are the same width and height of full capital letters, and non-lining figures share the same X height. So they're smaller letters, but they have ascenders and descenders. So let's look at it here. This is always a little bit easier to see. Lining figures, right? Full height of a capital letter, 1, 2, 3. Non-lining figures are the height of an X, right? 1, 2, and then 3 descends down, right? So the larger numbers are going to have that kind of a descender. The opposite would be true with an ascender. If you did like a 6, right? The tail is going to go up above in this context. Ligatures are specially designed characters that are done by the font designer when you combine 2 or more letters that are just awkward together. And you've probably seen this sort of thing happen if you were trying to cut and paste things together, or you're trying to draw it. This is something that happens really naturally when you write by hand. So for example, let's say you end something with 2 T's, right? What do you naturally do when you have 2 T's? If I can get a pen, maybe. Right, we have 2 T's coming together, right? I draw my 2 T's and I cross them. Right? We could do it in cursive, right? TT and we cross them, something like that. Okay, this naturally when you happen. If you had an F and an I, right, a lot of times you do something like that, right? You save yourself the little dot, or the dot becomes part of the F, those kinds of things. This is what I'm talking about, ligatures. This happens in fonts as well. The best fonts do these kinds of combinations, right? Two F's, two T's, right? The crossbar goes across. We have an F and an I combined together. This is connecting in, that goes there. So you see, this is the collision. This is when something bad happens. And this is the character that's been designed to take that place. In good operating systems, in good software, if you type two of these characters together, let's say two F's, the font will automatically substitute in the ligature character. Right? So you don't have to worry about, oh, let me select a special character. It should automatically substitute these in. But this is going to make a big difference in the legibility and readability of a particular document. Right? And also, you don't end up with these really awkward things like this, right? Where you have the dot glued on the end of the F and whatever. So, choosing the right font. This is probably the most challenging piece of the puzzle. Right? You've probably struggled with this before. If you've taken 121 with Daniel or a rec, chances are you did a poster and they said, this is terrible, go choose a different font. Right? If you use Times New Roman, anybody in the architectural world will probably throw up on you. Right? We'll just lay that out there. Right? Times New Roman is for English professors. Right? We hate it. So there are certain things, depending on what you're doing, you're going to use certain fonts, and that's understandable. So if I asked you some questions about the particular piece that you're doing, it would help you to decide on a particular font. So what's the overall longevity of the piece? Right? How long do you want this font to last? How trendy, right, basically, is the font? Can you use something that's trendy because it's only designed to last for a year or so? Or maybe a quick piece. What's the purpose of the piece? What are you trying to convey with it? You're going to pick a font based on that. Let's say you're doing a poster on Mies van der Rohe, right? Right in the height of modernism. Chances are you want to use a sans serif modernist font. That would be the logical choice, right? So you want to pay attention to that sort of thing. Do you want to try to be innovative? If you're trying to be innovative and cool, and then your piece kind of fades into the ether, and then you look at it again 10 years later, it might be really trendy and ugly, right? This happens if you were remodeling a bathroom and you picked tile that was really ugly, right? But at the time it was really cool, right? I worry about, the wood, this is way off on a tangent, but whatever. The wood tiles, the wood grain tiles that are really trendy right now? Those are going to be hideous in like 15 years. And everybody's going to be like, why did I pick those for my bathroom? Anyway, that's a side note. Do you want to be traditional, or is that too conservative, right? Those kinds of questions. So good example of this. You guys, well, some of you will remember, some of you were probably too young. This is scary when I say stuff like this. When Lord of the Rings came out, right, the movies, right? This was like 2000. Some of you are like, I wasn't born yet. No, I think you were all born, right? You might have been like 8 or something. Scary. I don't know how that happens. Anyway, they, in the movies, got really into the font papyrus. Right, and they used the papyrus font for a lot of the movie, like credits and all that sort of thing. And then there was this big explosion of papyrus is so cool, right? It's kind of old and kind of trendy and whatever. And people use papyrus on everything, right, for like 3 years, right? Now if you go back and watch the movies, or if you see something that's written in papyrus, you go, oh my God, that's so 2000, right? Or whatever. Because it's really dated, because it was trendy. Right? And that's what I'm trying to bring to light, is that things can be very trendy and very cool for a while, but if you want your piece to last for a long time, you probably don't want to pick that particular font. Right? And so it's certainly something to be aware of. Whoops, wrong direction. Right? A lot of times you want to actually do several iterations and compare fonts side by side to see what's looking good and what's not. And the easiest way to kind of decide on one is to throw a bunch out there in the same particular piece and say what looks best, what reads best, which feels right, and to be aware of that. So readability, emotion, legibility, right? Does it reflect the needs of the client or the viewer? That kind of thing. Okay, so there's this really cool thing called the periodic table of typefaces based on the periodic table of elements, which is kind of fun to look at. Doesn't really give you a whole lot of information, but it's cool, right? So we're going to show it anyway. However, I also have this great infographic, which I think is fantastic. It's hard to see on the projector, so I have a link to it on the website. But it's great because you say, okay, so you need a typeface, and you start at the beginning. And you say, okay, I'm going to create a logo. Okay, and then it says, do you want a sans serif piece or a serif piece, right? And depending on what you choose, right? I'm trying to figure out here. Okay, so let's say I want a serif piece, right? It'll drop you over here. Sorry, it's really hard to read on the projector, so I have to struggle with reading it a little bit, right? So how does the word sans, semi, or serif, sans or a semi-serif sound? And you either say good or bad, right? And if you say good, you come down here and it says, oh, you picked Rotus as your font. If you say bad, you come down here. So I gotta read it on here. I can't read it. Sorry. Something new, got serifs, got sans. You say, is that good or bad? And you come along here and you come down here. Is it an Italian restaurant? Yes. Okay, you come down here, you're going to use Bodoni. So it's this really kind of comical way of looking through these various fonts. I would encourage you to actually click on it and read through it because it's kind of funny. But it helps you kind of go through and what's appropriate for a particular font. And when you come down here and you say, yes, this is an Italian restaurant, and you get to Bodoni, then you think about the Italian restaurant that you went to recently, and you say, yeah, they probably did use that font, right? And so it's kind of humorous to go through. Anyway, you can play around with it. And see what works for you. Combining typefaces. So this is one of the big challenges when you're doing graphic design is how do you combine certain typefaces together so that they look good together. The easiest way of doing it is to take a single family of type, right? So let's say you're picking Helvetica, you're picking Arial, you're picking whatever. You stick within that font family and you just change bold, italic, that sort of thing. Okay, so you're sticking within the font family, you're not branching out. If, however, you want to branch out a little bit further, you combine two different fonts. And when you combine fonts, you're going to want a font that is a sans serif and one that is a serif. And the sans serif and the serif have to do with the little tiny tails on the letters. And so you want one that's clean and modern without the tails, and you want one that does have the tails. Good examples here, right? Sabon and Syntax, see the little tails that are at the ends of these, right? That would be a serif font. A sans serif without the serif, right, is something like Syntax here. It's clean and modern. These two combine well together. The easiest way of finding a font pair that are going to work together is to Google it, right? Take the font you want to use, then Google it, find the comparable one that works with it, so you don't have to sort through it as easily. You want to make sure that they have similar X heights and widths, right? Otherwise, they won't combine together really well. And so I have a bunch of examples up here, Big Caslon and Myriad Pro. If we look at these two X heights, right, they're virtually identical, which is important. And the reason that you might want to combine these together is because when we read, have a much easier time reading a serif font, right? The ones with the tails, our brain reads a little bit easier. A sans serif is a little bit better for titles and that sort of thing, but it's a little bit harder to read. So when you're picking your font for your English paper, the reason that Times New Roman is generally the default for your English paper is because it has all those tails on it. It's really easy to read, right? If you switched to Helvetica or something and turned in your English paper, your English teacher might give you a worse grade because it's harder to read the paper, not because the content of the paper is any worse, right? So that's why we stick with a serif font for that sort of thing. Right? Then we also have this other third category of font that's out there, and it's called a display or a script typeface. And this is when we're getting into a fancy title, or we want to do address labels on an envelope, or those kinds of things. And this is for fancy text, right? It's not something. If I were to turn in my English paper in a script font, right, the English teacher would probably murder you. And so you want to be somewhat reasonable about this, but for titles and that sort of thing, it's really good. So these can work nicely in juxtaposition to another type of font that you might choose, right? And so depending, this is a good example, right? Zeppelin 2010 is very different from any of the other fonts that are used here. That's the display font in this case, right? Not something that you're going to read a big paragraph that's written in the Zeppelin 2010 font, okay? So as we move on to designing with type, there's a variety of factors that we want to kind of think through as we work through this. We want to focus on legibility and readability, right, if we want essential communication, right? If we want this to come across, legibility is the recognition of individual letter forms, right, and their relative position to other letters. Readability is how the typography is presented, right, as words, lines, and paragraphs. And kind of a good way of thinking about this is, let's say I turned in, right, we're used to reading Let me pull up one of these as an example. Hold on a second. Right? We're used to reading text in this format, right? If I changed to this format and I wrote the text all the way along here, it would be much harder to read because the line length is so long, and I'd be reading like this versus reading, and you might have noticed this like on an iPad if you read an ebook, right? Sometimes you read it this way so that it's broken into two smaller pages and it's easier to read, right, than one larger page. And so you just want to pay attention to this sort of thing as to how somebody is actually able to read your document, okay? Objective representation, this is practical, straightforward, clear, ordered, hierarchy, that sort of thing. The opposite of that would be subjective representation. This is generally when it's a little bit more fluid, right? You're kind of throwing things out there, something like this versus something that's very technical, you know, laid out paragraphs and that sort of thing, right? You want to think about the macro perspective, the large-scale stuff, and also the micro perspective, which we'll talk about in a second. Macro perspectives is the overall design layout, right? It's the format of the overall composition. Is there a typographic? Sorry, my next class, the lecture's on topography, and today is on typography. So I'm going to get those two mixed up. It's going to happen, right? Do you have a hierarchy in place that kind of establishes what elements are more important than other elements? Come on, projector. Oh, amazing. Maybe. Look at that. Okay. So, is there that hierarchy, right? I will think before I make decisions that affect me, right? Micro perspectives are the small details. And this same design concept works whether you're talking about typography, or you're talking about architectural design, right? You want to think about the large picture stuff, the big moves, but also the tiny details and how they come together. And so the micro perspectives are all the tiny details, right? The kerning, the spacing, the tracking, the ragging, those kinds of things, which we'll talk about in a second, to ensure a very clean, concise, good presentation. Right? And so something like this is a great example. It doesn't even matter that it's in a different language, right? The point being, we have that nice font there that kind of identifies the header, right? Then we move into a smaller font that is talking through, the rest of whatever they're talking about. I don't really know, right? Notice that we do have small capitals used there for that name, right? But it doesn't stand out too badly, right? Because it's not providing emphasis. They're not full cap height letters. Symmetry and asymmetry, you probably thought about this from compositional techniques. Same thing happens in type. Is there symmetrical text? Is it balanced? Is it harmonious? Right? Is it asymmetrical? Does that provide some kind of motion through the design and that sort of thing? If you're doing a poster, maybe you're looking for something asymmetrical. If you're doing a paper, a history paper or something, maybe you're looking for something symmetrical. So you want to think about what the final product is. Right? Alignment is the horizontal and vertical positioning of the type within whatever margins you have established, right? Alignments is going to create the visual relationship between the other content and your words, right? And so you want to think about that alignment and what's appropriate. Typographic color is also important. Not so relevant in the I'm looking at this right in front of me stage, but if you ever have type on a poster board or on the wall or on a poster or something like that, this really matters. Type has a relative weight and a heaviness to it depending on how dense the type is. So if you're all to squint at this, you can pretty easily pick out what are the darker pieces, what pieces leap out towards you, what pieces recede away from you. Depending on the size of the text, depending on the density of the text, that's typographic color, right? It's squinting at it and you can kind of control how heavy something is in a particular presentation. Type size, I know you're all familiar with, right? This is, I have 12-point font, I have 10-point font, that sort of thing. It's measured in points. Changes in type size by themselves, without changing font, without changing style, you can get a hierarchy just by changing the size of the text, right? So it's a really easy way of creating some hierarchy, right? Case also is important. Lowercase letters are far more readable than uppercase letters. Uppercase letters, the way we read it, we have to actually identify every single letter, right? And in our brains, we translate and go much slower when we're reading something. And so this is something that you can use to your advantage as a graphic designer, because you can say, wait, this is something I want somebody to slow down and really read. The coolest thing is our brains actually don't, when we're reading lowercase letters, our brains don't actually read every single letter, right? So I might put something like this up here, and my guess is you could all read it, right? Which is a really cool example. You've probably seen something like this through an email chain or Facebook or something like that, right? So when you read something like this, for example, it doesn't matter what order the letters are of the word appear, right? We can read it really easily. The point is, our brains look for certain forms of words rather than individual letters when they're lowercase. We look for the first letter and the last letter, and we have a pretty good guess at what the word means based on its length, right? So if we scramble the letters, we can still completely read the sentence, right? So it's a pretty cool way of looking at our letters. I should do another slide with all of this in capital letters, and it would be significantly harder, right? I need to have that slide. Next semester, I'm going to have that slide, right? Kerning adjusts the spacing between individual letters, right? And so we have some examples here, right? The default spacing of type, the corrected spacing. Notice the Y sticks underneath the T. And again, this kind of corresponds to if I were writing the word type, I would naturally write it like that. I wouldn't write, sorry, I need an eraser. Right? I would naturally write not, right, with that space. Right? This would naturally go underneath the T. Does that make sense? Okay. So, by default, we have to make sure that we correct those kinds of things. Okay? A lot of times the fonts do it for us, the computers do it for us, but it's certainly something to be aware of. Right? It's used to correct letter collisions, unwanted spaces, that sort of thing. And it allows the text to flow really smoothly. There are certain letters that are always going to be problematic. Capital T's, right? V's or slanting letters, A's, those kinds of things are going to have issues. And so we want to adjust the kerning on those. Tracking is the same kind of thing, but it's going to adjust words, lines, and paragraphs, right? Kind of how spaced out. It's kind of like switching fonts into an extended font, though it doesn't stretch the individual letters. It just kind of stretches the overall words. This will make more sense when we do it in InDesign, and you can kind of see what happens. Okay, so bear with me when we get there. It'll make some more sense, right? This will influence typographic color, so how dark your paragraph appears in your reading, right? Leading is kind of like the word equivalent of double space or single space, right? Leading just says how much space is between one line of text and the next line of text. And you'll notice that when we get into InDesign, there isn't the ability to say, oh, this is double spaced or this is single spaced, right? We're just going to adjust how much space is between the individual lines. You're going to look at it and say what's appropriate, right? So something with a tall X height or a heavy typeface, sans serifs, they need more leading, more space between the lines than shorter, lighter, wider, or serif typefaces. So if you're reading a newspaper or you're reading a magazine, the body text is almost always a serif font. That's because they can squish it down, right? And they can get a lot of text in a small area, small column, that sort of thing. And so that's why it's more readable. Okay? Another example here of just a really nice, clean typographic piece. Very few images, right? The images live, but there's a great hierarchy, right? The quote is something the designer wants you to think about and read carefully. Therefore, it's in all capitals, so you concentrate on it, right? Smaller information, distinct hierarchy in the upper corner gives information about the particular piece. Another example here, a couple pages away, again, the nice capitalized quotation. You got to concentrate to read it. And then the smaller bit of information down the road. Okay, page further on, right? A little bit more readable text. Obviously, on a projector, you're not going to be able to see this sort of thing. A serif font, so it's easily readable. The line length is not too long, so it's an easy paragraph to read. Right? So you're thinking through all of those challenges in the world of type to make your piece really easy and clear to read. Okay, so we're going to stop there. And we're going to hope that